And this is the Minute. Okay, we've got a first alert cut-in for you this afternoon to spotlight some of the intensity of the rain that's been coming down over the city and the peninsula for about the last hour and a half here. A couple of things to put in the headlines here, just to make sure we're all aware. The amount of rain that's been coming down over San Francisco and the peninsula has been enough that the National Weather Service has just within the last couple of minutes issued a flash flood warning for the city. And the rainfall amounts have been enough that means you're probably going to start encountering some flooding on roadways. We know some of the trouble spots in San Francisco, specifically through the Mission, locations that kind of follow the old drainages of how water used to move through San Francisco. So from Mission Bay back out towards the Mission. Those same places, if you think back to, it was New Year's Eve, 2022 going into New Year's Day 2023. That was when we had the last issue with pretty impressive flooding through parts of San Francisco. And it was those low-lying spots that were the most vulnerable to this. And if we take a look at what's going on First Alert Doppler now, we'll come back to this in a second because I do want to track the rain. And you can see how impressive those rainfall totals are there that are falling over the city. And that's been consistent enough now for long enough that it has led to already noted and witnessed minor flooding through the city. And because of that, you've got the National Weather Service having issued a flood warning. So I'm just going to switch from that view, and you're going to see a map that's got a flood advisory on it for most places that are in green. But the real challenge with this is that the area in red there for San Francisco actually falls under the flood warning. So what we're going to do is we're just going to update that, and we're going to highlight the red because the areas in red on here are the locations where we're dealing with a flood warning, and that's going to stay in effect. I believe it's until 4. Billy, correct me on that. What's the timing on the flood warning here? How long does that stay in place for? It's going till 4 o'clock, I believe, was what the issuance was on that. And that would make sense considering how long it will probably take for much of the worst of this to work its way and flow off the kind of the old hydrologic boundaries that are contained within the city. And a lot of those trouble spots fall within places we became familiar with. It was just a little over a year ago, which was the last time that we had rain of this intensity. All right, we're going to take a look at this in 2 ways now. You're going to see the radar box in 1, and I'm just going to steer this around to pick out where some of the heavier amounts of rain are coming down now. We're going to come in for a close-up look at the city itself. So the way the flood warning goes is it's issued specifically for Sacramento County and City, and of course we all know that's the same entity. And when we look at some of the heavier rainfall amounts on there, you can see where we're looking at that deeper shade of red. And that's where we've got enough rainfall over a short enough period of time that it's a fast runoff. The topography plays a big role for San Francisco. If we think about where some of the higher ground is, you can think of San Bruno Mountain, which sits down around the Mission District, and all that then, or I should say sits up above the Mission District. And that's where the old creeks and streams that want to get eventually over towards Mission Bay would be working their way towards. And you can kind of, when I refer to Mission Bay, we're basically talking about the area over where Oracle Park is now. That's the part of the city where most of the water is trying to get to when it flows off the higher elevations. And we'll come in for a closer look here. Where we're talking about the higher elevations, you can see where Twin Peaks is, right in the middle of your screen. So that's high ground. And there are a lot of old historic waterways before we put pavement and concrete over all of this stuff that is still there. And those waterways can get reactivated on big rainfall days like this. And the best example of that, again, is to go back to what we experienced here on New Year's Eve 2022 into 2023. An easier way to say that is not this New Year's Eve, the one right before it. Now, that was a different situation because we had record-breaking amounts of rainfall then. On that day, I believe it was 5 inches of rain had come down in the city, something close to that, and it shattered records. We're nowhere near that, and this is not going to be as long duration as that was. That also plays a big role in this. The rainfall right now is probably as intense, maybe even a little more than it was from that event. But what stood out about that event was that rain band stalled over the city. Now, this one's not stalling. Let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to put this back into a loop, and we're going to watch it. It's moving. There is a back edge to this. Let's come over here, off towards the west side of the city. So where we start to see those lighter shades of green showing up right there, that's where we're going to get a little bit of relief from this. And the rainfall will lighten up. But if we go even wider on that now and take a look, this line is progressing almost perfectly. Let's change our perspective on that. It's coming up directly from the south, moving to the north. And in that sense, it's kind of like a train where you've got all these boxcars. And this is not only San Francisco, by the way. This has been going like this over the peninsula for about the last hour and 15 minutes. The way this has been developed, it's come across almost perfectly aligned to get some of the greater population centers of the Bay. The reason why I'm focused on San Francisco at this point is because that most recent issuance coming out from the National Weather Service is that one. That's the flood warning. So far, they have deemed that only to be necessary for the city and county itself. And that almost certainly has to do with the two things we're looking at here. The confluence of some of the heavier rain coming right over the city, but also what we know about the hydrology of San Francisco in terms of how the water can very quickly run from high ground down through a very densely populated urban area with old waterways that are going to reemerge and kind of show themselves in situations like this. So I'm just putting the radar back into the here and now. You see the timestamp up on the upper right there says 2:08. So this is live, and we're looking at this most recent image. And the color codes on here are still shaded fairly orange and red. If there's one good thing on here, we've got the lightning detection turned on this. And not only over the city, but even when I zoom out, we're not detecting a lot of that. Now, I know there's been plenty of it. Heard it myself, and you no doubt have heard this yourself too, if you've been outside at all over the city or the peninsula. We don't get it often enough here, so it definitely grabs everyone's attention when it happens. And about an hour and 15 minutes ago, when this cell really began, it did have several strikes of lightning with it. And right here, we're looking at the last 3 hours. I want to slow this down. And we're just going to take a look at the last hour. And I need to slow that down even more, because if you just look at an hour of radar at that speed, you're going to miss the details. That's what I want you to see. So if we go back an hour ago, that's pretty steady. Let's extend that a little bit. Let's take this out to 2 hours and now watch that play through. And we're going to kind of see the same story, but we'll at least get a little bit more on the life history of this. So going back 2 hours now, the timestamp up there shows us that this actually started right about noon. And not only over the city, let's get the wide view now. We can see this had already been going. It started coastside for the peninsula right about noon. And very shortly after noon, this first spread over places like Burlingame. And now not only the city, but if it's leaving the city, and it will over the course of about the next 45 minutes, that just means it's going east. So one way we want to get a handle on this is to take a look at the futurecast, and we're going to use what we often refer to here as the high-resolution rapid refresh, which is the best way to get a handle on real time, what's happening not only now, but over the course of the next few hours. These are the forecast models that can really pinpoint that. And I'm just going to slowly drag it. You see the timestamp up there has this at 2 o'clock. And it's picking up on the line. It's not picking up on it perfectly, but it at least does see the line, and it'll show us the progression everything's going to move. This is what matters. That gets us from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. I'm going to bring us back and watch that line. It's kind of a faster way of taking the live radar we were just looking at and just playing it forward for an hour using the best technology that we'd have to see how that line of rain is likely to behave. It doesn't go exactly the way it looks right there. These forecast models can very rarely ever depict cells of convection like this perfectly. But what we do want is the movement, right? Because if this was sitting stationary and that didn't move, this would be a very different situation, because then we'd have a much higher degree of concern. Where it stands now, that line of rain is still responsible for what the whole reason is we decided to come on and keep you updated on this. That is the flood warning. So even if that rain is moving, the National Weather Service issues a flood warning because of events that are currently happening. So oftentimes you'll hear a watch or an advisory, and those are things to raise the awareness so that you know what is going to happen or could potentially be coming. But when you hear the word warning, that's a very specific term from the National Weather Service to make it explicitly clear this is happening now and you should take precaution. And at this point now, it comes down to just knowing your surroundings. What part of the city are you in? Are you in higher ground? In which case, you're probably okay. But if you're in the lower elevations of the city, and in some of those drainage areas, i.e. moving from high ground like San Bruno Mountain, Twin Peaks, Buena Vista Park, any of those locations, and if you're downhill from those, especially towards the east, it's likely that this applies to you a little more than it might to somebody, say, who's out on the west side of the city. And the other area that we don't want to downplay, I'm going to spotlight Mission Bay again, because this is your kind of your waterway from high ground out to Mission Bay. These were the trouble spots a year and month and a half ago, last New Year's Eve, when we had that historic rain. But we also had issues here on the waterfront. And this is also low ground. Think of Pacific Heights. And when you go from Pacific Heights and you work your way down towards Marina, that is a steep drop. And there are also low spots here where we know the water can collect. It doesn't mean it's going to flood Fisherman's Wharf like it did last time. And there was some dramatic pictures of Fisherman's Wharf flooding on New Year's Eve, 2022. It's doubtful that happens with this, but it does need to be taken into consideration if that's where you are, especially if you're in the Marina District and you know some of those lower homes down there, which tend to have some issues with garages and lower levels on days like this. Those are some things to take into consideration at this point. And then there's also the roadway aspect of this. So you can stay off the road now, it'd be great. This would be a time to put off any travel as we wait for those heavier bands of rain to move back off towards the east and maybe give the city a little bit of a break and a little more time for some of this water to kind of flow off the landscape. I'm just checking in on real time, so I'm going back to the map here that highlights where the flood warnings are. And at this point, we're doing okay in terms of flood warnings, but bear with me for a moment because I want to change the detail on this map. And what we're going to see show up, instead of the red box, which is perfectly outlined on here for the city and the county, I'm going to bring back in the advisory, which goes a little bit later than 4 o'clock. This advisory extends out a little bit longer. So if we're talking about wording that the National Weather Service uses, the warning obviously is the primary concern. But look at all of these other places that have one level lower than that, which is a flood advisory. So that's the peninsula. And we know from looking at the peninsula on radar that there's been a lot of rain there. But your vulnerability to the kind of flooding that we're likely going to see moving through parts of the city is a little bit lower. And not to be left out of this, let's go to the South Bay. We've got a camera that sits above the Santa Clara Valley, and that's looking out towards, it's very difficult to tell, but I think this is probably a good way of at least coming away with the perspective of rain on the higher elevations that surround Santa Clara Valley. So you've got a gray shot here. It's just got a lot of drops kind of obscuring the view. Let's go to another view. Let's go down into the bay, and that's the scene from San Mateo Bridge. And this is always going to look dramatic to the distance, because you kind of lose sight of the bridge off in the distance. That happens on hazy days. But it's also going to be a lot more pronounced on days when the rain's coming down like this. So you've kind of got a combination of two things there. There is good rain coming down on that bridge, and here's your traffic report. So far, traffic is moving along. Just, it's kind of more like typical commuter traffic there. It is 2:16 right now in the afternoon. So that we're looking at the traffic there heading off with the headlights coming our way. It's going fairly slow. Let's take a look at another camera. This is the view from the Mark Hopkins Hotel in the city, which is where the primary concern rests now from a flooding standpoint. And really, this just kind of gives us the vantage point of the visual of what the rain looks like from here. Let's go back to the radar. And when we do that, we're going to see, again, how widespread this is. There's one other feature now that is showing up on here that I want to come in for a close-up look. And if you follow that line from, say, SFO, which sits right about down, well, just north of SFO. There's SFO here, which also has a good amount of rain coming down on it now. But if we come back for that wider view, watch that line. Look how it extends across the bay, heads over towards Alameda, and then starts to line up here so that it's just about to start moving in across the East Bay. So what I'm going to do with that is just show us what the last hour looks like on here again, because this will kind of give us a good idea on the motion and the direction of this. And we'll watch from that vantage point. There's the last hour. So you're seeing those lines, which had been over the city, which were enough rain over the city that the National Weather Service ultimately issued a flood warning there. And that line of rain is now working over towards 80 as it moves through the East Bay, Berkeley. And then that goes to the Berkeley Hills. And when that happens, the intensity will pick up a little bit. We'll get a lot more runoff in that case, too, for downhill locations. And then we'll start talking about any issuances that might need to happen there. But there haven't been any that have been put out at this point yet for those locations. If we take a look at how much rain has fallen so far, this is going to look a little, let's see if I can get over that. I'm going to step out of frame for a second. I'll be back. But in order to do this, I just want you to, oh, good, this will still work. I just want you to see what rainfall totals have looked like over the last hour. And this is a fantastic tool. It's operated by the National Weather Service to give you real-time rainfall amounts as they're occurring. You can set it to any time frame. I wanted to look at an hour because that's going to be the important time frame from a fast accumulation. Look at the number here for San Francisco. That's Market Street. It's a little less than an inch in an hour. That's why we have a flood warning. And there are a couple of other numbers here that start to show up. That 740 is a false reading. But these are the higher elevations up here. So we're taking a look at where Twin Peaks would be. And the numbers here, thankfully, mercifully, are not terribly high. That's a quarter of an inch of rain in an hour, which is not too overwhelming. But as I move the map here, we're going to follow the course of old buried waterways as they try to work their way over here. That's where we're looking at Mission Bay. There's Chase Center. You can see Chase Center there. Oracle sits right up about here. And this is the old waterway that extends back towards right in through here. This is where we had some of the worst flooding back on that New Year's Eve event. Not this New Year's, but the New Year's just before. And if you take a look over here, look at some of the rainfall totals. So, without having reports on the ground yet that I can share with you, the two areas to highlight would be here. And then again, we're going to come back to the lower elevations that sit here on the waterfront. And this is as simple, really, as just going back to what occurred in the last flood event here in the city. This one is not going to play out the same way. It's a very different kind of rain in terms of duration. Even if it might be somewhat similar on intensity. That's the last hour. Let's just take a look at the last 3 hours because there's, it's cumulative. We've gotten a half an inch of rain here off Twin Peaks. But again, half an inch in 3 hours is better than it could be from a flooding standpoint. It does make this somewhat less dire, but it's bad enough that the National Weather Service has issued a flood warning, and we're just going to take that at its word. And we'll take it as seriously as we can in terms of making sure people are aware before you run into any issues for your part of San Francisco. So we'll go back to the loop because as important as it is to focus on that flood warning, we know this is not just a San Francisco rain event. So if it's all funneling up from the south, we can see a fair amount of rain in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Thankfully, the Santa Cruz Mountains have been able to absorb this okay. The San Lorenzo River, obviously, is always a big concern down there, and we've been watching the forecast on that for the last 3 days, and the forecast has remained below flood stage on the San Lorenzo River. It doesn't mean smaller streams and creeks still don't approach their banks down here. You've got a flood watch. Bay Area wide, and that includes the Santa Cruz Mountains, so you should still be on guard there. But thankfully, you avoided the worst of the rain from this particular cell. And we're watching now for the locations that are no doubt hearing the rain pick up in intensity. And if you are hearing that over here, anywhere from Alameda, Oakland, Berkeley, up to Richmond, here's the cell responsible for it. And we know this, even if it's thankfully not stationary, the speed at which this is moving along, we'd like it to go faster than it is. So it's still going to have some time to continue to drop enough rain that you should be aware that there'll be some issues on roadways and there'll be some flooding concerns. Regardless, even if we haven't gotten any extension of that flood warning yet, and just to go back to that, you can kind of see where the flood warning is on here now, and National Weather Service has not extended that beyond the city and the county of San Francisco. And there is one other flood warning, by the way, and that's the one that sits up here, and this one has been in place since yesterday. And I apologize, there's only one locator on here, and that Santa Rosa is in the wrong spot. Santa Rosa, as we all know from looking at our maps, you're over here. So what we're seeing through that red box are places that are more like, you've got the west side of that valley there. Forestville, you're in that. Sebastopol, you're in that. These are the smaller streams and creeks that have been moving through, you know, what's oftentimes, if you live up there, we just call it West County. And those communities up there are the ones that have been under a flood warning since last night. We were talking about that last night when we were on the air, and we were tracking the heavy rain all through the evening last night. But just to go back to what is a much bigger issue, simply from the greater population center, and it's more urban flooding here. That flood warning through West County up in Sonoma is a lot more landscape stuff. You will have some street flooding up there, as you have overnight. But this is a different kind of flooding. It's a lot faster, and it's a lot easier to catch people off guard and by surprise. And there are a lot more people here to get caught off guard and by surprise than up in West County, up in Sonoma, with all of those communities that we were just talking about. So the reason why we're here with you now is just to get the word out on this one. It stays in effect until 4 o'clock, and probably the best thing to do is just to keep an eye on how this is behaving with the rain. So we'll go back to the radar and we'll watch the bands of rain as they kind of continue to move. So when we talk about the lightning, see where that is now? All off towards the east, thankfully. You can see, this is a 3-hour loop here. So it's a wider view, and it goes back a little bit longer than the loops we were looking at a moment ago, which gives us a little more of a background on the life history of this particular band of rain. I was talking to our weather producer here, Billy Poon, when I came in today, and he'd been watching this radar for a solid hour and a half or so before it finally came on shore, and he made an observation that this was actually 2 separate lines, which merged into one, and then turned into this large complex. And if you're into this behind-the-scenes meteorology stuff, there's a term for something like that. We call those mesoscale convective complexes. Now, this one's almost driven in a little more on a cold front, so it might even not necessarily qualify for that. But regardless of whether it does or not, it's providing a widespread area of consistent downpours, much wider than what you would typically see on a garden variety front. This is more of a complex, and it is more spread out over a widespread area, which is why San Francisco obviously gets the focus now. You got a flood warning, and that's a big deal, and you're the only place right now from an urban setting that has it. But it doesn't mean that the rest of the Bay doesn't find itself under a similar situation momentarily, but that's a call. We'll wait for the National Weather Service, who have far more eyes and measurements on this from their office down near Monterey, and the tools that they have to verify if and when that is needed. And we're going to wait for their guidance on that. before we then pass that message along to you. But in terms of where the intensity is now, how about the MacArthur Maze? How about the bridge tolls? I don't know if we've got that live camera, guys. Do we have the live camera available where we can kind of check in on the toll booth at the Bay Bridge? Because radar is one thing. It often helps to take a look at these scenes in real time. And if you've got a camera available, and the network of cameras we have spread out across the bay is fantastic. The challenge with using our cameras on top of the Salesforce Tower today is the Salesforce Tower is probably just going to be looking at clouds at this point. So we've got that camera that looks from Salesforce off to the east. There we go. So here's one good sign on this, right? As ominous as the radar wants to make it look, the truth on the ground here is it's raining. And the windshield wipers are going, and you can see you've got that classic mist coming off the back of these cars as they're driving through all that rain. But these are cars that are heading towards the toll booth, and they're not even slowing down as they have to do that. So it's probably not that big of a challenge here traffic-wise. Let's go back to First Alert Doppler, and I can show you what that exact location looks like, because this is where we're looking. We kind of have our bearings. We know where that toll booth is. We were just watching all those cars drive in here. The other thing about radar is this beam is kind of high in the atmosphere. So when you look at a radar depiction like this, it's very close to what's happening on the ground, but it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be a little bit of a delay and a little bit of a lag, only because we're actually reading a much higher level in the atmosphere than what you're getting on the ground. So it's moments like these where that does become a little more apparent. What we want to do in this point is just watch the motion. We know the bands have been coming down heavy enough because of the rainfall totals that we looked at when we were looking at the gauges in San Francisco. And some of these were able to drop about 3/4 of an inch of rain in an hour, and that's definitely flood potential rain. So we know that's there. That's our truth on the ground, and we were able to measure it in time. And so we know that line has the potential, and that line's moving east. And that line is now sitting over Berkeley at this point, probably having already made it up to the higher elevations there through Berkeley. And just to watch that again, since this is the part of the bay now which is going to experience some of the heavier rain, we'll put that back into a loop, and I'm going to put this on the last 30 minutes, just to kind of come away with what the last 30 minutes of rain have looked like, and you can see those bands of rain continuing to march their way into the East Bay. And there's the bigger view on this. So where's the back edge? Still right now, just about to work its way over towards Ocean Beach and the sunset, and it's taken its time. And even before you get to the back edge, where you've got those shades of green on there, where the rainfall does lighten up, let's just put this on the here and now for a moment. Let's stop it right there. Okay, that's 229, and that's the here and now. So we haven't really gotten that break yet for the city. Still coming down at a pretty good clip there, and there are still returns on the radar where the radar beam shoots through the cloud, bounces off the heavier rain, comes back to the radar. So you'll hear the term radar returns. And when they start flashing back at red, that tells you that there's a higher congestion and congregation of things the radar beam is bouncing off, i.e. rain. And that's that line right there, those higher rates of return in deep red. That was an update. So that's another aspect of doing this live and in real time. It's nice to see it shade down to the lighter colors. It doesn't mean the next update coming in a couple of minutes doesn't pick up that shade again like that one. So you really want to see a trend over about 10 minutes before you really start to get comfortable. And that back edge is still persistently hanging out over the city and down the peninsula, and then it lightens up as you go south. So the rain down here that we're looking at for the Santa Clara Valley, and we've got a camera in downtown San Jose, so if we can work on that one next, guys, we'll see where that one's pointed. Oftentimes it's pointed at Minetta. But it looks good on radar, but this is likely nowhere near the intensity of rain that we were seeing coming across the city. Raining, yes. Flood watch, yes, you have. You've got a flood watch in the Santa Clara Valley. And we know that that's been a concern there for really since this thing started. Let's take a look at San Jose. Here's a live picture. And it just kind of looks like a regular run-of-the-mill rain situation when you look at the view here, and you can kind of see a little bit of traffic down there as well with the cars. The cars are moving along just fine. And I can do an adjustment if we wanted to see what the rainfall rates have looked like across other parts of the bay. Here's a comparison. In fact, let's switch. I'm going to switch now to that scene. Back on the weather computer. I've placed it on the Santa Clara Valley just to see what rainfall totals have looked like down here. So I'm going to step back over to that. And when we take a look at rainfall totals here, there's really not a whole lot. This has a lot to do with the rain shadowing effect of the mountains on that west side of the Santa Clara Valley. That mountain, the camera we were looking at when we very first started taking a look at live pictures sits up here. And there's plenty of rain falling up there. But those mountains have a way of absorbing the bulk of it. And this is so classic for the Santa Clara Valley as a whole, where the rainfall totals are fairly light. I've switched this to 3 hours now. And over the last 3 hours, you really haven't gotten a whole lot of measurable rain. I know it's rain down there. And if you are watching this from the Santa Clara Valley and you're saying, well, I've gotten rain down here. Yes, but it hasn't tipped the buckets much. Look at the difference when you go north. This is 3 hours worth of rain. And even at that, for the peninsula, these are manageable rainfall amounts for 3 hours. Granted, it's not so manageable on the hills, where we've had several days, and before that, several very impactful storms over the last couple of weeks. The ground saturated, so from the flood watch standpoint, especially on these downhill side communities along the peninsula, it's the rural streams and creeks that are a concern there. And that is a different flooding than what we're seeing here. And these are the numbers in San Francisco once again. And look what happens. Remember now, this is a 3-hour setting. That's just about an inch of rain for this location. That's the official weather station, by the way, for downtown San Francisco. So what's notable about that is this is, hands down, the most accurate and trustworthy weather station you're going to find in the city. And you can take this back 3 days. So pardon the screen going white there, but I just wanted you to watch the last 3 days here of history of rainfall for San Francisco. These are the numbers over here adding up. So you've got 1243 here, and 607 inches of rain fell like in that hour-long period. And then you go to 143 here. The numbers are small, but look at that jump. This is really just kind of telling us the same story, that the rainfall picked up when we know it did, because we've been watching that story. And if you missed what's probably the more important part of the flooding concern for San Francisco, if you've got your bigger rainfall totals here, the water through much of this part of the city naturally wants to follow old streams and creeks that are buried now, but can reemerge and impact the streets that have paved over them on their way out to Mission Bay. And you can see the creek there, and you can see those lower lying elevations down through here. There's where South Van Ness is. There's Guerrero. Mission Street sits right here. Where was the flooding on that New Year's Eve event? It was basically right through here on Mission Street. This is when you saw people, it was kind of humorous because nobody got hurt, but people were going down Mission Street on little makeshift rafts just a little over a year ago. And that was the stretch of Mission Street right there. And if you've ever gone over, there's the Japanese restaurant Rentaro, which sits right here. We did stories on them, on how they recovered from the flooding that inundated that restaurant. It sits right next to Rainbow Grocery, which is also right over here. Rainbow had to close for a few days. I can tell you from personal experience because I couldn't go. Those are the areas, and you don't see the topography so well here. I'm not saying those areas are flooding right now, by the way. I'm saying those are the areas that should be the most mindful when a flood warning has been issued for San Francisco, because they're a little more vulnerable. And then, of course, it's the lower lying elevations that are down along the waterfront. And a lot of that stuff for the city down by Fisherman's Wharf and the waterfront there, a lot of that has to do with city infrastructure too, and the way the water gets funneled there faster than it can handle it. But it is a low spot right underneath Pacific Heights, and that does play a part in that as well. So we're going to keep watching this. I believe our time's coming to an end, guys. Let me know what we'd like to do next. We're going to wrap this up. We've got a newscast coming up at 3 o'clock. So we'll have coverage of it there. And we're going to leave you with the live picture from Treasure Island, which sits right underneath one of those heavier bands of rain right now, looking back towards the city. A pretty rainy scenario there. Much more on this. We're going to track that flood warning, and we'll bring up First Alert Doppler as well, coming up on KPIX Live at 3 o'clock over the air and streaming. We'll see you then.
For the most part today in our forecast, we're really just seeing cloudy skies with a splash of showers here or there. But up in the North Bay, we can see some heavier pockets of rain really form into the afternoon hours. And that's where I'm keeping a close eye on. As we head into the afternoon, areas like Santa Rosa, Novato, Petaluma, we can see those heavier storms move from offshore, just like what we saw yesterday. And we'll continue to watch that trend into the afternoon hours as there's a lot of instability in our atmosphere just hanging around. Now, here we go into the evening hours tonight. Notice how our friends down in the South Bay near San Jose and Livermore sees closer to around 1/100 of an inch of rain, but all the way up into the North Bay, that's where the impressive numbers are going to last for us. We clear up into the overnight hours and we see some unsettled weather in the forecast tomorrow, but that's just light passing showers in our Wednesday forecast. It'll clear up fast as we head into Friday and Saturday.
Well, the latest storm is leaving behind a lot of problems for drivers all across the Bay Area. That's especially true in the East Bay. This is along Highway 84. A partially collapsed road forced the CHP to close Niles Canyon Road. Our Sean Titness tells us what the next couple of days could look like in this area.
We're here along Niles Canyon Road right before the road is closed and signs are up telling people to turn around. This is off of Mission Boulevard, and this is a stretch that is very popular for folks to get between Sunol and Fremont, so we know it's going to be an inconvenience for a lot of people, likely closed for a couple of days because a piece of Niles Canyon Road went into the Alameda Creek. Here's the video that shows you that damage. It happened between Old Canyon Road and Main Street in Sunol. The area is prone to erosion and slides from the hillside above. A portion of the eastbound lane of Niles Canyon Road collapsed into the creek. While crews were able to keep the road open with one lane for most of the day, they did close it completely on Monday night. Caltrans now needs to fully evaluate the damage. All of this a little more than a year after residents nearby were evacuated because of concerns they would be trapped by mudslides or washouts. Now, there have been no plans for evacuations this time, but again, the road will be closed for a couple of days. No clear plan on when they'll be able to open it up. That all depends on the work that Caltrans is doing, so folks will need to plan accordingly and avoid the area until then.
And still ahead, helping young students find their voices in the Bay Area, we introduce you to the woman creating a safe space through the arts. And a reminder, you can stream CBS News Bay Area wherever, whenever. Catch all of our live newscasts plus news and other updates throughout the day. Find us on the free CBS News app or on Pluto TV.
Why are more people turning to KPIX Late Night? 2 reasons. Sarah and Stephen. The Late News with Sarah Donchie. Then The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Back with all new episodes.
Really?
2 shows you'll want to spend the night with.
Then go to sleep knowing you won at TV. What?
Record it, stream it, watch it live. The Late News and the all-new Late Show. Weeknights starting at 11 on KPIX.